Alright, we should be live. Hello everyone. This is Thomas Dylan Daniel. I'm doing The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. Or Sir Karl Popper, we might want to say. I've unfortunately noticed that I'm having some technical difficulties with the videos once they're uploaded to YouTube. What's happening is that the text that we're looking through is very difficult to see, and what I want to do here is just record a short video. I believe the resolution should be far sharper for us, and unfortunately we are not able to stream live via Twitch at this time. So I apologize to all of the Twitch viewers. I think there are only two, but I need to get my bandwidth figured out. And I have some RAM that I can add to this computer, and that may speed things along a bit for us. So maybe all is not lost on that front, but I am evaluating this technology stack to use for a lecture series that will go through line by line my first philosophy book, Formal Dialectics, and I'll throw a link to that in the Twitch, in the YouTube description, and I will also throw a link to Amazon to pick up this copy of The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. So thus far we've looked into the history of the book a little bit, and we've read the preface by George Soros and the introduction by Alan Ryan, and Karl Popper's friend, whose name I forget at the moment, his comments on what it was like actually getting the work published. So we understand the history of the book a bit better, and we understand Karl Popper's personality to some extent. He's a bit disagreeable, but overall a pretty good dude, it seems like, and this philosophical stuff is just absolutely everything to him. So, without further ado, actually, let me close the door. My dog just paid a visit, so, he can unfortunately be just a hair noisy, so we want to try to keep him out while we're recording these. Apologies for that. And now let's get going. This is the preface to the first edition of the work, and he says, "If in this book harsh words are spoken about some of the greatest among the intellectual leaders of mankind, my motive is not, I hope, the wish to belittle them. It springs rather from my conviction that if our civilization is to survive, we must break with the habit of deference to great men. Great men may make great mistakes, and as the book tries to show, some of the greatest leaders of the past supported the perennial attack upon freedom and reason. Their influence, too rarely challenged, continues to mislead those of us on whose defense civilization depends, and to divide them. The responsibility for this tragic and possibly fatal division becomes ours if we hesitate to be outspoken in our criticism of what admittedly is part of our intellectual heritage. By our reluctance to criticize some of it, we may help to destroy it all." And so what Karl Popper is doing here is just sort of evaluating what the stakes are for his work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Why is this something that you as a reader should read? And at the end of the day, it's simple. He is teaching a tradition of critique. As we noticed in previous videos, he is not someone who is a radical left thinker. This person, Karl Popper, is more of a centrist, and he is more committed to the concept of democracy than he is to any particular allegiance to an economic system. He isn't that interested in economics. He's mainly someone who is interested in science, and his goal is to have science be one of the languages that the world speaks in, and to make certain that people don't do things to interfere in the scientific tradition, right? So there's this sense in which science needs to be given priority for Karl Popper. Moving on, he says, the book is a critical introduction to the philosophy of politics and of history, and an examination of some of the principles of social reconstruction. Its aims and the line of approach are indicated in the introduction. Even where it looks back into the past, its problems are the problems of our own time, and I have tried hard to state them as simply as I could in the hope of clarifying matters which concern us all. Although the book presupposes nothing but open-mindedness in the reader, its object is not so much to popularize the questions treated as to solve them. In an attempt, however, to serve both of these purposes, I have confined all matters of more specialized interest to notes which have been collected at the end of the book. So what Popper's saying here is that he is putting this work together in a way that's designed to be readable. We may end up needing to skip to the notes at some point. We may not. I believe there's a substantial amount of content there, so it may even necessitate a look on its own at some point. But the goal here is not just to philosophize and to look at problems that do not have a solution. It's not to popularize the problems either. It is to create what Popper sees as an account of a philosophical system that he believes he has identified, which can actually solve these issues. So let's move on to the preface to the second edition, which is a little bit longer but not much. And let's just read through this quickly. He says, although much of what is contained in this book took shape at an earlier date, the final decision to write it was made in March 1938 on the day I received the news of the invasion of Austria. The writing extended into 1943, and the fact that most of the book was written during the grave years when the outcome of the war was uncertain may help to explain why some of his criticism strikes me today as more emotional and harsher in tone than I could wish. That makes sense. We'll see as we get into the actual text of the book that Popper is very, very hard, in particular on Plato. And though I believe he can be forgiven for this, I do actually criticize him in my philosophy book, Formal Dialectics, which took 4 years to write. So I think it's amazing that he spent about 5 years on this. And it's a substantially longer book, so he was working very, very hard and spending a lot of his time on it during that period. Philosophy books just take a long time to write. That's it, at the end of the day. He says, but it was not the time to mince words, or at least this was what I then felt. Neither the war nor any other contemporary event was explicitly mentioned in the book, but it was an attempt to understand those events and their background and some of the issues which were likely to arise after the war was won. The expectation that Marxism would become a major problem was the reason for treating it at some length. So wait a second. This comes back to something that's important to me philosophically speaking. I believe one of the things that philosophy does is it gives us reasons to expect certain things in the future. We become able, when we think philosophically, to accurately anticipate events that have not happened yet. And essentially what I see here is sort of a prelude to the strength of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, which lasted from the 40s through the 80s after World War II. So that's fairly impressive prognostication there on the part of Popper. Okay, so seen in the darkness of the present world situation, the criticism of Marx, which it attempts, is liable to stand out as the main point of the book. The view of it is not wholly wrong and perhaps unavoidable, although the aims of the book are much wider. Marxism is only an episode, one of the many mistakes we have made in the perennial and dangerous struggle for building a better and freer world. Not unexpectedly, I have been blamed by some for being too severe in my treatment of Marx, while others contrasted my leniency towards him with the violence of my attack upon Plato. But I still feel the need for looking at Plato with highly critical eyes, just because the general adoration of the divine philosopher has a real foundation in his overwhelming intellectual achievement. Marx, on the other hand, has too often been attacked on personal and moral grounds. So that here, the need is rather for a severe, rational criticism of his theories combined with a sympathetic understanding of their astonishing moral and intellectual appeal. Rightly or wrongly, I felt that my criticism was devastating, and that I could therefore afford to search for Marx's real contributions, and to give his motives the benefit of the doubt. In any case, it is obvious that we must try to appreciate the strength of an opponent if we wish to fight him successfully. I have added in 1965 a new note on this subject as addendum 2 to my second volume. No book can ever be finished. While working on it, we learn just enough to find it immature the moment we turn away from it. And to my criticism of Plato and Marx, this inevitable experience was not more disturbing than usual. But of my positive suggestions, and above all the strong feeling of optimism which pervades the book, the whole book, struck me more and more as naive, as the years after the war went by. My own voice began to sound to me as if it came from the distant past, like the voice of one of the hopeful social reformers of the 18th or even the 17th century. But my mood of depression has passed, largely as the result of a visit to the United States, and I am now glad that in revising the book I confined myself to the addition of new material and the correction of mistakes of matter and style, and that I resisted the temptation to subdue its tenor. For in spite of the present world situation, I feel as hopeful as I ever did. I see now more clearly than ever before that even our greatest troubles spring from something that is as admirable and as sound as it is dangerous, from our impatience to better the lot of our fellows. For these troubles are the byproduct of what is perhaps the greatest of all moral and spiritual revolutions of history, a moment which began 3 centuries ago. It is the longing of uncounted men to free themselves and their minds from the tutelage of authority and prejudice. It is their attempt to build up an open society which rejects the absolute authority of the merely established and the merely traditional, while trying to preserve, to develop, and to establish traditions, old or new, that measure up to the standards of freedom, of humaneness, and of rational criticism. It is their unwillingness to sit back and leave the entire responsibility for ruling the world to human or superhuman authority, and their readiness to share the burden of responsibility for avoidable suffering and to work for its avoidance. This revolution has created powers of appalling destructiveness, but they may yet be conquered. Okay, and that's fantastic. I think, Popper has done an excellent job of establishing his goals for the work here. What he wants to say to us is, look, it is not okay to build these authoritarian traditions and uphold their absolute value. Nobody has ever been absolutely right about anything for Popper. And so we're in a situation when we read this man that we need to understand that what's happening is that Karl Popper is evaluating arguments, not speaking the truth to us. He's doing something much more open. He's giving us his thoughts, and they are presented as his thoughts. And so when he talks about being uncharitable to Plato and to Marx, I think he gets a pass on that because he has already clarified to some extent that he is pontificating here, and what we're doing is we are appreciating the arc of that contemplation without actually holding it on a pedestal, so to speak. So what we're doing is we're engaging in a form of criticism with Karl Popper, and he can be the subject of it as well. But at the end of the day, we are not meant to take any of this as gospel. one extremely suitable example of that is the introduction by Soros, which was one of the first pieces in this video series. And in that piece, what Popper does, or excuse me, what Soros does, is he explains his criticism of Popper. So, really, I mean, he means it. Nobody is immune to criticism, especially not himself. And when I see these other writers saying things like, he was an insufferable maniac, pretty much, but a brilliant man and a good friend nonetheless, my heart kind of goes out to them because I can kind of understand where they're coming from. I think my impression, at the very least, of what Popper is up to here is that he is involved in creating these theories, and he is creating the ones that he's creating because he thinks they're the best theories. And so when people critique him and they suggest to him that he should do it a different way, he is not very willing to hear that criticism. And I would wager that part of what goes into his reluctance there is the fact that he's already thought of these arguments and considers them to be answered by his own work. So definitely a bit of an ego, but as Aristotle said, arrogance is unwarranted confidence, and warranted confidence is a virtue. So, I think it's very good, and I can't wait to get further in. I think the last video that I probably do tonight will actually be the introduction to this book. So we're gonna move from the preface to Popper's own introduction, and then from there, either tomorrow or Friday, I'll get back in here and start up with Volume 1. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're interested in what we're doing here, and feel free to follow along.